Listen to the voices of the advocates.
Groundbreaker. That so aptly describes our next guest on Advocates, the podcast. Michael Kirby was the first Justice of the High Court of Australia to come out as openly gay and is a champion of gay rights. He has had an illustrious career on the bench of the High Court of Australia, but you get an opportunity to listen to Ruslan and I speak to him about not just that career, but his less well-known career as an advocate at the New South Wales Bar. Here is Michael Kirby. So can I begin by thanking the Honourable Michael Kirby for being with us this afternoon from Sydney. Michael, thank you so much for being a guest on our show.
It's a pleasure.
Can I begin, Michael, as we always do with these interviews, by getting you to tell us a little bit about your childhood and your parents and where and how you grew up?
My parents were young. I came along when they were 21, 22. My mother's family were from a family in Northern Ireland, of Northern Ireland Irish Protestant people. They were very well educated and they were mostly feisty women. Two of them, one of them became a leading botanist of Ireland, and another a leading portraitist in Ireland. My father's family had come over earlier from the Catholic part of Ireland. So I was a sort of product of a so-called mixed marriage. But I was brought up in the Protestant tradition, and I went to the local church. I still would count myself as an Anglican Protestant person. I went to public schools, and that was in a sense unusual because when I was on the highest court in Australia, I was for a long time the only justice who had been educated entirely in public education, which is free, secular, and compulsory. I did very well at schools. We have a system in New South Wales of streaming clever children. That took me to that stream and then to selective public high school where I did very well. I didn't come top of the ducks of the school, but I was the second in the school. I went to university and I did very well in university results. And then I became a solicitor and then I became a barrister. And then at a very early age, I was appointed as a judge, snatched from my cradle.
Yes, we'll explore that. But let me go back a little bit and just ask you about that childhood in Australia. Growing up, when did you realize that law was the path that you wanted to take?
Well, pretty early, actually. Somebody came to our class when I was in fourth class. So I would have been about 8 or 9. And they said, they asked the children in the class, what do you want to be? And I said, I want to be either a judge or a bishop. One way or the other, I was determined to get into fancy dress. Then I went to this school, Fort Street High School, which is the oldest public secondary school in Australia. And it had a long tradition of lawyers and judges. And indeed, there's only one school in the nation that has more justices of the High Court of Australia than Fort Street. That's Sydney Grammar School. It was the sort of breeding ground of lawyers. I was very good at school in history, English, debates, plays, anything to do with the gift of the gab I could do. And sport, well, I wasn't quite so brilliant, but even there, I took on refereeing in rugby union football, pretended that I was interested in sport, but basically I thought it was a real serious interruption to my business of getting on with my studies. And that's what I mainly concentrated on.
Well, that's very un-Australian, isn't it?
I'm afraid so. Probably ultimately it may be investigated by the Un-Australian Activities
It may
Committee.
well be. It may well be. Not liking sport in the outdoors, my goodness. Let's turn now to university, and you did very well in university in your first degree law. Were there professors there that stood out for you that you took lessons from all the way through your career?
Well, probably the greatest influence on me, and not only on me, but on a lot of the people, the justices of the High Court and the Court of Appeal, was Professor Julius Stone. Stone was a legal philosopher. And he was a legal philosopher in the tradition of Roscoe Pound in the United States. He believed in telling it as it was, and he insisted that judges have choices. They have what he described as leeways for choice, mainly because, as he explained it, the English language is basically the mixture of two linguistic streams. One, the Anglo Saxon Germanic language of the original people of the British Isles, and the other, the French stream, which was brought over by William the Conqueror and his clerks. So, for every concept in English, there are two words. The French word, which tends to be the words of the written language, and the Germanic word, the Anglo Saxon word, which tends to be the language of the kitchen and ordinary discussion. It's interesting to think about this, but it's the reason why English is such a strong culture for literature and why it presents so many opportunities for lawyers, because every word is always sort of nuanced and has an ambiguity about it. So that means that words in constitutions, in statutes, in contracts, words generally are ambiguous, and that gives judges choices. And when Justice Mason, a very great judge who was on the High Court of Australia before my time, just before my time, in the Mabo case, which was the great case that upheld the right of the Indigenous people to access to their land, when he was criticised by some conservative lawyers for making it up and deciding cases otherwise than on the law, he simply went like this to the books behind him and he said, "Where do you think the common law came from? It came from judges deciding cases with the ambiguities and uncertainties of our language and deciding them in particular ways and explaining why they decided them as honestly as they could." And he said, one of the factors that can influence you in going one way rather than the other way is complying with fundamental human rights and universal rights and human dignity that is common to all human beings. And that includes not denying the Indigenous people of this continental country any interest in their land. And that's what the High Court of Australia, led by Sir Gerard Brennan, but supported by Sir Anthony Mason, decided in those days. And that's basically been a big theme in my life and in my judicial service.
Yeah. And that's something you've obviously, it's a lesson that you've carried through from law school. Now, did you know while you were in law school that you were going to go into practice rather than academia, for example?
Oh yes, I never really intended to go into academia. I was very good in debating, and I wouldn't say I had the killer instinct, but I like to explain things, and so I really knew I was going to go into the academic tradition. Judges would come to our school, and I would think, oh God, they look ancient. They were probably about 20 or 30 years younger than I am now, and I thought, well, they look ancient, but they're very dignified, and They have a position of power and a responsibility, and that's what I would like to do. And I did that, and that was a great opportunity.
So that's interesting that you had judicial ambitions so very young.
Yes, but you see, in Australia we have the divided profession, as in England, and if you really think you might have a future in the law, and you would, as they say, entertain the possibility of being a judge, then you have to really basically become a barrister. And once you do that, then you're sitting there in court and watching a professional judge at work, and you see how they do it. And I must say to you that my very first day as an article clerk, I went up to that court with a litigant, and I had to, in inverted commas, instruct counsel as the first day article clerk. And we lost the case, which was a terrible shock to me. But what really excited, impressed, and thrilled me was that the minute the evidence was finished, the judge paused, he reached and he had a glass of water, and he then launched into his reasons for decision. And it was a very, very impressive thing that he could sort of summarize all the facts and all the law that was applicable and come to a conclusion and make his orders. And I thought, boy, I don't think I could do that. But with time, you do realize that you can do it. I'm going to have a glass of water on that.
Yes, please do. Just let me wind back a little bit before we come back to the beginning of your journey as a lawyer. Now, two things about university I'd just like to complete. First is you did a degree in economics after you did law. Why was that?
First of all, I was always very interested in economics. I got first class honours in economics in the school leaving certificate, and it was a very practical subject, and so I wanted to do it. But secondly, by the time I got to the end of my arts and law degrees, I was involved in student politics. I was the king of student politics. I came to Malaya and to Singapore as the president of or as the representative of the National Union of Australian University Students. And I later became a life member of that. And so I was the president of the SRC and the president of the union, the president of the Law Student Society, and I became a very good chair of committees because there were endless student committees deciding all the battles that students were involved in. And that taught me how to be a good chair, which involves respecting the people you're chairing and giving everybody a fair opportunity to have their say. And essentially, it was a very good preparation for my judicial life. So I had these examples of the judges in the daytime, and then I would go at night to economics and learn about the economic dimension of the world, including of the law, and then the committees of the students. And it was a very busy life, but it was a very rather lonely life as I look back on it, because of the fact that at that time I was required to pretend that I was a straight man, that I was heterosexual. And I wasn't heterosexual. And I knew enough about the work of Dr. Kinsey in the United States and the scientific research that was coming out to know that this was just ridiculous, that it was unscientific to have to pretend that you were heterosexual if your sexual orientation was homosexual. And so I just thought, well, that is rubbish, but that's what society requires. So I've just got to go on pretending. And I thought that'll probably last my life, because it had lasted for thousands of years in the Judeo-Islamic Christian tradition. But eventually, science, it's very hard to confront and overcome science and the knowledge of science. And therefore, rather rapidly in Australia, all of that came unstuck, and I was able to be open and honest about my sexuality.
Can I just visit that for a second? I mean, clearly one of the factors would have been that Australia in the 60s and the early 70s was a very conservative place.
Yeah, it sure was.
But when did you realize that that was your orientation? How old were you when you
Well,
came to
I
that
could ask
conclusion?
you, when did you realize your sexual feelings? You know, in my case, I would say it was when I was about 11, maybe a bit younger, maybe 9. But you see, Kinsey was doing his research. He did his book on the sexual behavior in the human male. He published, I think, in 1948. And sexual behavior in the human female, he published in 1953. He was actually a zoologist. He was an expert in bees,
Is
in
that right?
wasps. He was an expert in, he had millions of samples of gall wasps, and he studied them endlessly. But in the end, at about the age of 45, he got bored with wasps and he turned his attention to human wasps, human beings. And that was a great blessing. So, this professor at, of all places, Indiana University in the Midwest of the United States, became the world expert. And that was splashed all over the papers in Australia. I don't know whether in Malaya at the time, maybe the censors would have kept it out, but it was everywhere, and Hollywood got onto it. The First Amendment in the United States Constitution meant it was very difficult to suppress, and he became something of a star and went around the universities, and that came to my mind just at the right moment, because I was 11 in 1951, which is the year I went to high school. So round about that time, Dr. Kinsey's research came into my mind, and I thought, well, okay, I've got to pretend that I'm straight, and that's what my society wants of me, and I suppose I'll have to do that because I learned that it was a criminal offence to do anything about your sexuality. And so that was a coincidence that was very beneficial for me, because I was a very bright young kid, and I was keeping pace with this. And of course, I fell upon and devoured all the information about Kinsey. We didn't have Wikipedia in those days, but there were newspapers and books on psychology in the universities, and so I just kept up to pace with that, and that made me feel better. And I knew, well, I've got to pretend I don't like it. I certainly didn't like it with my family, because my parents were very loving. My brothers and sister were very loving. My church actually was very loving. You know, I used to go to the local Anglican church. Never once did I hear them denouncing gays and going into the bedroom. The minister of religion had been a padre in the war. He probably served in Malaya and during the wartime, and he was interested in what had happened to the Jews in Germany. And he invited Pastor Niemöller, one of the very few Lutheran ministers who stood up against Hitler, and that was what he was into. That was what he thought the Christian message and the Judeo-Islamic Christian message was. It was message to love God and love one another, and I was very comfortable with that, and I still am comfortable with that, and that's why I haven't rejected my religion. But it's unfortunate that religion has been, because there are people in law, in the judiciary, who just love what they think is the answer to every question in words, and they don't realize that words are ambiguous, and especially in old texts, and therefore you've got to look at the context and give meaning to old words in a way that is comfortable with scientific knowledge. And That fortunately, my minister was of the latter persuasion.
That's intriguing. Let's now turn to your career as a lawyer, and I think the first thing that occurs to us is, as you pointed out, if the ambition is to be a judge, you've got to be a barrister. So, what took you down the road of being a solicitor first?
That's what usually happens in Australia. I don't
Right.
know if that happens. I'm not sure that happens in England. I think they go to the inns and they read, and I think you really copied that, whereas we in Malaysia you copied it, whereas in Australia it was a sort of indigenous system that you became a solicitor, and some then went on to become barristers, and the length of time you dawdled as a solicitor varied. My colleague at law school, Murray Gleeson, who later became the Chief Justice of New South Wales and of Australia, and he was there when I was, he went within a year.
To the bar.
To the bar. I took 5 years, and I always told him that made me rather more practical, and I had to sit across a desk with the client, not in fancy dress, but just in ordinary street dress, to explain things and to listen to the client's lamentations about law and facts and life generally. But I took 5 years, and then I went to the bar,
Right.
and that was how I started off in that branch of the profession.
Can I ask? And I think it's probably peculiarly, in a way, in a sense of the jurisdictions and people that we've interviewed in Australia, that you take that route as a solicitor and then a barrister. Do you think that spending those years with clients and dealing with clients in a way that a barrister doesn't makes you a better barrister when you do take that?
Not necessarily. It depends on what sort of work you're going to do. I mean, I don't see how you could really be a good criminal law barrister or a family law barrister if you haven't had an experience with spending a lot of time and, in a sense, learning to be empathetic to the predicament of the client and how to explain things to a client, and that it's not a theoretical construct. The thing is a very practical problem solving system, the common law. And so I don't want to lay down any general rule, because people take their own paths in life. Frankly, I think our system of doing a spin as a solicitor is a better system, because it does get you ready for the more isolated life as a barrister, which can sometimes tend to make people a bit more theoretical and not as practical as being a solicitor does. But anyway, that's what I did, and then I went to the bar, and I had quite rapid success. I started out in workers' comp cases. I then moved into industrial cases, because we have a system of conciliation and arbitration for disputes, and then into quite big constitutional cases. And then I was whisked away to the Arbitration Commission, which was the national industrial relations body, and then even more quickly to the Law Reform Commission, which was really the big opportunity that I got at the age of 35. Very big opportunity.
Could I just ask, how did you make that transition as an advocate, as a barrister, from handling employment, industrial matters to constitutional cases, in which you said you did towards the end of your time at the bar?
Well, it depends on being noticed, and it depends on being noticed by solicitors. I can't say that in those 5 years when I was a solicitor, I was rubbing shoulders with the Commonwealth Crown Solicitor or the New South Wales Crown Solicitor at the time, and therefore that didn't give me the opportunity to be a constitutional lawyer. But when I became a barrister, I started to do the industrial relations work. And as industrial relations in Australia is quite close to the political divide, because the union side is quite close to the Labor Party, and the employers' side is quite close to the bosses and the Conservative, the coalition parties. And so then people started to notice me, and I don't know whether it was my economics training, but whatever it was, they thought I was pretty good, and I was pretty good. I tell you what, all I did was work. Work, work, work. My partner Johan says his secret is not inspiration, his secret is perspiration. He works very hard, and I still work very hard. I'm doing a very big arbitration in India at the moment, which is literally concerns billions of dollars, and I'm still working very hard in things that people much younger than I would find daunting. But I like the challenge.
Yes, don't stop. Let me ask about your life as a barrister and some of the techniques that you developed. First question about your life as a barrister is, was there anyone who you worked with, a leader at the bar at that time, who inspired you, and if so, how?
Yes, because just as that first judge on the first day launched straight into his decision in a case, so I would be working close. We have, and we had at that time, the QC system, the senior counsel, the junior barrister, who would have to do a lot of work to prepare and help the silk present the case. And, there are, I hate to say this, but some junior barristers who are just plain lazy. They think it's a dream run. They think they can just turn up and swan around and look decorative when the poor old silk has got to do everything. I always worked as if I was going to be called on, that my beloved leader was going to have a heart attack or a stroke, and I was on my feet. And so I was always working very hard. And I think that gets around, people do realize this is a workhorse. And I wasn't an old draft horse. They do exist in the law, but I was a workhorse who would work very hard on my cases, and I wanted to win. And that put me into working very hard to find ways, by ingenuity, by imagination, by reading widely, by reading in a wider range of case law, to find arguments that could win the case. And whatever the reason, I started to get a lot of briefs, too many briefs, and they would pile up on my desk, and they're still here, and I'm still working, and that's just, they say, for older people, that it's important to keep your brain working, because once you start sort of relaxing and smelling the roses, that's very bad advice. You're not going to keep it up. Some people start that and then they just sort of give it away.
Yeah. You start off smelling the roses and end up pushing them up.
That's exactly right.
That's what you want to avoid.
I never thought of that. That's a good explanation.
But let me ask you, in the types of cases you did as a barrister, and it's really interesting, because you're known worldwide as a judge. I mean, that's really the heart of your career. But I'd like to explore a little bit more about your life as an advocate. And so, first thing I'd like to ask you is, did you prefer trials, or did you prefer sort of appeals and arguing points of law? What was your forte?
Well, my forte was trials, but for the plaintiff or claimant. I was very good in building a case. I still am, but I didn't have the, what'll I say, the unpleasantness in my nature that took delight in destroying somebody. You've got to have those people, and they're very important in argument and in presentation to make the system work. But I was good in presenting and building and getting it together, and I came to enjoy the appellate work. And, I think I found very, very early the secret of good appellate advocacy, which essentially is try to put your mind into the shoes, if you can put a mind into shoes, of the person up there who is really looking to you to help that person reach a just and lawful decision. And so I was criticized a bit for my advocacy in appeal work by one barrister, Ken Handley, his name was, a very good judge. He was my colleague on the Court of Appeal of New South Wales. He said, you're all the time putting up false issues and presenting hypothetical matters, but I was actually talking to the judge from the starting point of the context in which the case comes and working through the context, even though it wasn't in dispute, but because that would provide the context in which the judge, usually in those days a he, would have to come to an analysis of the problem and reach a conclusion. I was setting it in context. There's a decision of the House of Lords that says context is so important to interpretation and to everything in the law. In real estate in Sydney, which is a big issue, it's location, location, location. But for law, it's context, context, context. And so I would build these cases, including very big cases in the industrial relations area, by setting the context and taking a little bit more time maybe than others who would go straight for the jugular. But that was how I think judges think of a problem. They try to see it in a wider context. The good judges.
And that seems to be something that was instinctive for you as an advocate, rather than something that you picked up from someone or observed.
Yes, I think so. Although I did have a number of barristers who were very good teachers. One of them was Harold Glass, who was a very good judge and later became a judge of appeal in New South Wales. And he sat with me in cases when I became the president of that court. And another was Gordon Samuels, who likewise sat with me in the Court of Appeal. There were no women judges of appeal in those days, and that is a big defect which has been improved in the legal system of Australia. But I think it was a feature that I saw in one barrister whose name was Neville Wran. Now, Neville Wran became ultimately the Labor Premier of New South Wales, and I did industrial relations cases with him. I was not a member of the Labor Party, as he was, and I really didn't much like the idea of going to all the prawn and beer nights that were the fate of those who got involved in the Labor Party. The coalition might have been closer to my desire because they would have champagne and canapes, but prawn and beers wasn't really very attractive to me. But Neville loved to see, and this was the politician maybe coming out, he loved to see how the solution in a particular industrial relations case would fit if it became a general rule in the industrial relations field. And so he liked, and he did this contextual setting, and he wasn't as elegant as some of the brilliant silks that I saw, but he was very, very thorough, and he became a very, very good politician and Premier of New South Wales because he would never be beaten by the public servants on his thoroughness. He would always be totally on top of his brief. And he used to start work in the morning at 4:15. And my job as his junior was to be there at 4:15 to make a pot of tea for him. And, many barristers who had...
Sorry, can I just check? That's AM, right?
What's that?
That's 4:15
AM.
AM.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
4:30 AM. And I got into that habit, and I'm still in that habit. I came into work today at 5:30. I'm slacking, but it's the best time of the day. And you're fresh from sleeping. You're not going out there at night, going to discos and nightclubs and so on. You've got a clear mind. At that stage, there was no telephone, there was no internet, there were no emails, and you prepared the case. And that was very good training. Neville Rand gave me that training.
Michael, you mentioned context. Of course, and as an advocate, you said also the important thing is to explain to the judge the context of a particular case. How do you handle judges who are, let's just say, a bit impatient, who just wants counsel or the advocate to go straight to the point, go to the kill, and here you are trying to explain context so that he would understand the argument. How do you persuade this kind of judge to just hang on a minute, judge, listen?
Well, I wouldn't put it quite as bluntly as that, because that would only lose the most important person in the court, apart from the client. But I would say I would like to establish this because, and then I would explain. I'd give a taster, a goo. I'd give something that would maybe intrigue them as to why I was doing it this way. But to be honest, I didn't find many judges pushing back. I think if they respect you as a hard worker, if you are somebody who's waffling and you haven't read your brief and you don't know the problem and you haven't thought it through, which is very important, then you are a menace, and they will deal with you very quickly. But I didn't have too much. I had trouble with a few judges, but on the whole, I mean, we had the starting point that in Australia we've never had the removal of a senior judge for corruption, and therefore you can generally look at this person and think, well, he's a bit of a dope, or he's not really very bright, but he is the judge, and I've got to respect his office and help him to come to a decision that favours my client. But I don't know why it was, but I think it irritated my colleagues at the bar more than it irritated the judges. The judges would just sit there and listen, and they knew after they'd seen me a few times that this was a very hard-working person who was serious about his cases, who was respectful to the court, serious and respectful to the client. I never sort of spent time cracking jokes in the presence of the clients. A little bit of humor is okay, but for a client, a day in court is a very stressful day. And you've got to remember that they will talk about you decades hence. You will have totally forgotten their case, but they will say, Mr. Kirby, my barrister, said to me, you are a very important person in their lives, and you're always on show, and therefore you've got to be courteous to them. I think coming from parents who were not wealthy, who were very intelligent and had families with very intelligent and educated people, but they weren't part of the establishment. I think that in a sense meant that I never felt myself more important than my client. I always respected and tried to understand the predicament of the client and take their problems seriously on my shoulders, and convince them that I was going to do my best within the law to win the case for them.
I think that's priceless advice, and I've got to remember that word menace for someone who's not prepared.
This episode of Advocates, the podcast, is supported by Taylor's Law School, where you master the skills, tactics, and ethics that these top advocates will be talking about.
Let's just wrap up this part about your life as an advocate before we turn now to spend a little bit of time about your career on the bench. Now, it's been said, I think Sir Anthony Mason said this when launching the Michael Kirby and his legacy, appealing to the future. He said of your judgments as a High Court judge, he said, they are eminently readable, even though sometimes lengthy. It does not have this heavy grinding style. It is said if you want to find out what a High Court case is about, you should read the Kirby judgment. And that's what Sir Anthony Mason said about your style of writing judgments. You've also written, I think, about legal writing as well. You wrote something called The Plain Concord, Clarity's 10 Commandments for Plain Language. So obviously, and speaking to you earlier as well about sort of the power of language, I think what comes across is you take the process of writing and communicating very seriously. So my question to you, Michael, is this, is for our listeners, for young advocates coming up, tell them how you go about writing to make sure that a judge understands your written work.
Well, it's not only the judge who has to understand it, but also the legal profession when they come to look at the case again, the academics when they come to look at it, and the litigants who probably won't pore over it, but who have that right, and sometimes they will. So I was actually sitting in court very soon after I was appointed president of the Court of Appeal. And to be honest, I thought that was going to be my métier for the balance of my life. And it was a very great office in our legal system in Australia. And I looked over to my left, and my colleague, Justice Dennis Marnie, was sitting there. Now, Dennis had been a big tax lawyer. He had a very big practice in the High Court of Australia. People were very surprised when he took a judicial appointment because he was making a tremendous lot of money doing tax cases for very big business people who wanted to make sure they minimized the amount of tax they had to pay. And I saw that when we were sitting in court, he was writing constantly. And I later asked him, this was in my first days as president of the Court of Appeal. I said, what are you writing, Dennis? And he said, we are not here to enjoy ourselves. We are here to slog away at this hard job and to make sure we don't miss anything. And you have to use your time on the bench to plan what is the ultimate product that you are paid to produce, which are the reasons for judgment. And therefore, you've got to start planning the minute you sit down. You are not there. It's very seductive to sit there, especially if you're in a court of appeal or in the High Court of Australia even more. You've got the best counsel in the country. They're arguing and you see this challenge of minds and they're brilliant people. And it's very easy just to sit back and think, boy, this is a close case and how on earth am I going to decide that? He said, you've got to start planning. And so from then on, I went back to how I had done my studies as a law student and indeed at school. And that was by preparing tree diagrams with the major concepts and then the minor and then the small and then the tiny growing out of the major. And that is how I spent my time as an appellate judge.
And is that what you did as a barrister as well? I'm interested in how you did your written work as a barrister as well.
Yes, I did really. It helps you basically to conceptualize and not lose the wood for the trees, because that's the problem with a case is unraveling and unfolding, hopefully not unraveling, but it's unfolding very quickly and sometimes unraveling, and you've got to try and rescue it. So you've got to know what the main points are. This is again the search for context, and so I just followed what Dennis Marnie taught me. And it was a very good lesson. And thereafter, I didn't just spend my day having a good time. I think the problem, again, this is another menace in the judiciary of judges who are slow, sometimes very slow, sometimes tortoise slow in getting their reasons out. And it's because they don't realise that they're there and they're paid to get the product. And that's what people want. And so I would do that. And I think that also helped me to do what came naturally to me, and that was to write in the same way as I speak. I think what Sir Anthony Mason was complaining about, and I certainly would say the same about some judges, they are the captives of the clerks of William I and of the French Norman kings and all of those with artificial language. And I think if my reasons are easier to understand, I think it's because I write as I speak. I'm a real proponent of the Anglo-Saxon clarity and sharpness of expression. Don't forget, I'm the very last generation in Australia that went through civil juries. Most of our prime nisi prius cases were decided by juries in my very early days, and I would see barristers rise to speak to a civil jury, which was 4 citizens in those days, 4 men, to try and persuade them, and they therefore had to simplify very much the problem and try to explain why their side should win. And so I'm the last of that tradition, and I think that was also a help.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. So, I mean, for advocates as well, the simplicity comes from you can write the way you speak. Yeah, let's turn now, Michael, to I mean, your meteoric rise, the youngest man to be appointed to federal judicial office in 1975, when you joined the Arbitration Commission. I don't want to delve into your judgments. There's a body of work there for anyone to read. I, for one, enjoy them. But there are a couple of things I'd like to ask you about life on the bench and all the way to the High Court. The first thing is Australia obviously has a tradition in the common law. And how does the High Court approach cases that come from the UK? Has there been a step over the years to establish Australia's own jurisprudence without reliance on those cases, or have courts been very open to cases that come from the UK, decisions that come from the UK?
Well, when I started, we were locked into the decisions of the UK because we were subject, except in one small matter, to appeals to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, the same as Malaysia and Singapore and other countries of the Commonwealth in those times. And a lot of people now attack that, but that had an advantage for a rather small jurisdiction with relatively few practitioners. It locked us into a great metropolis with very clever judges and uncorrupted judges, and they decided cases for the whole world, and they had a degree of cosmopolitan attitude just because they were applying a statute of Malaysia one day and the Gold Coast last week, and next week there were cases from Guyana or some other country of the Commonwealth. So it wasn't all bad, but by the 1960s, gradually it was removed. First, they removed appeals in federal matters. Second, they removed appeals from federal courts. Third, they removed appeals from state supreme courts. And then by that stage, there were no further appeals. And so by 1986, there were no appeals. I actually, as president of the New South Wales Court of Appeal, sat in the very last Australian case to go on appeal to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council.
Right.
And thank goodness they upheld us in the New South Wales Court of Appeal. What a shame it would have been to have been struck down in my prime. I'd only been on the court for 2 years, and it was a case in the equity jurisdiction, complicated case, but we were upheld, and that was it. They had a little drinks party afterwards. That was the end of the Australian appeals, and they were quite relaxed about it. But when that happened, we still had the English cases on our shelves, and therefore we would still use them. And when I was president of the Court of Appeal from 84 to 96, we were still de facto substantially still locked into the English cases. But increasingly, and with growing power, the High Court of Australia said, why has the learned Judge of Appeal used a decision of the English cases when there are decisions of the High Court of Australia in this? Their duty is to start with the High Court of Australia, and if we haven't dealt with the issue, then it is perfectly appropriate to have regard to other jurisdictions. But so I, as it were, lived through that transmogrification. And if you'd looked at my bookshelf before, when I was first appointed, I when I was a young clerk studying law, I bought two things. I bought the Australian Law Journal, which had a supplement which had the High Court of Australia cases, and I bought the weekly law reports, which gave me the English decisions of the House of Lords, the English Court of Appeal, and leading English decisions. But by the time I got to the end of my years in the New South Wales Court of Appeal in 1996, using the English case was much less frequent. Now, on the bookshelf behind me are the decisions of the High Court of Australia. This is the Australian Law Journal, which goes back to 1927 when it started, which is a sort of national journal of record of the Australian legal profession and its legal issues, and the New South Wales reports in the distance, and out of shot are the decisions of the law reports of the Commonwealth. And they are the reports which have decisions from Malaysia, from Singapore, from Guyana, and from all countries, Cyprus, of the Commonwealth, a selection of them. And I was always interested to dip into them because, not all clever people live in Australia. Some Australians think that once you go through the heads of Sydney, you're in no man's land. Well, there are actually some rather clever people, especially in commercial law, in Malaya and Singapore. I think I'd probably rather have a defamation case to study from England than I would of some other jurisdictions closer to hand. But there's a lot of wisdom in other countries and very, very good indexing nowadays. And of course, there's the World Wide Web nowadays.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
all of this has changed radically in my lifetime, and I've changed with it.
I'd like to ask you about when you came out as gay in 1984. The question I have is, how did you determine that was the right time for you to come out?
Well, it was determined for me in a sense that the first steps were taken a little obliquely, and they occurred because I had been chairman of the Law Reform Commission, and it did a lot of work on medico-legal issues. Human tissue transplantation, for example, was one of the first reports that we did. And I was very interested in medico-legal questions. And then by 1978 or a bit later, the HIV/AIDS pandemic hit. There has been a pandemic before COVID, and it was called HIV/AIDS. And when it first came to Australia and to the United States and Britain and other countries, the first people who suffered were gay men. And they suffered because often they were very alienated and they didn't have access to a lot of advice and information. And therefore, my friends started to die. People that my partner Johan, whom I met in 1969, people who'd come to dinner with us, who were our friends and very nice people, some of them lawyers, most of them not, they started to die and die in large numbers. We had 12 very close friends who died. And it was an awful time, a really awful time. And so my partner Johan said, we've got to do something about this. And he became what's called an Ankali, which is an Aboriginal word for buddy. And many of the people, including gay people who got HIV, were very isolated. And even their gay friends didn't want to have anything to do with them in case they got the virus. And so it was a terrible time. And I began, because of my work in the Law Reform Commission, I got to know people who would come to Australia, and I was introduced to them, who were leaders in the World Health Organization struggle to deal with AIDS, although there were no drugs at that time. And that were curative. And so Johan was a buddy, and I would go with him as his handbag, as it were, and I began to be invited to international conferences and committees to think about what can we do, as we don't have a vaccine and we don't have a cure. Now, there's still no vaccine against HIV. And all that you could do was to try to inform the vulnerable groups. And so that is what I was trying to do at that time. And when Johan and I talked about it, we thought, well, this is enormous, and our duty is to do what we can. Our friends who are dying and are dead really demand that of us. And so we started to go to functions, and I would speak at functions about the importance, for example, of getting rid of the last vestiges of the colonial anti-gay criminal laws, because they were isolating of people and putting them out of contact with the news about the presence of the virus and what they could do about it. So in a sense, HIV chose me and chose my partner, Johan. And that was why Prime Minister Keating knew that I was gay when I was appointed to the High Court of Australia. Indeed, he said to one of his first assistant secretary, or he said, there, Bill, that's one for you, because this officer in his private office was himself gay and not secret about it. So, that officer said to him, Prime Minister, have I got news for you? He was saying, this is not the first, and it won't be the last. And anyway, that is what happened. And at first, we were not open in the sense of putting the flag up, but eventually, after a couple of years, Johan insisted. He said, we owe it to young people to do something about this. And I said, oh, don't you think I should delay this until after I've left the court? And he said, definitely not. Definitely not. It's important you do it whilst you're on the court. He's from the Netherlands. And he thinks, you won't believe this, but he thinks Anglo-Saxons are very hypocritical. He thinks we who are the children of the English tongue are so nice to everybody, and then we stab them in the back.
He might be onto something there, actually.
Yes, he might. But anyway, that's why by 1997, we were out, and
Yeah.
that I think was a good step, and I think it was good for the judges, good for the judiciary of Australia generally, good for the High Court of Australia, and they all loved Johan. Some of them could only take me in small doses, but they all liked him because he's very, very witty.
What an incredible story. Let me ask you now, before we turn to the quick fire round, because we've only got about sort of 5-7 minutes left, and just one lesson from Michael Kirby sitting on the Australian High Court, looking at advocates appearing before him. What's one lesson you can impart to advocates appearing in appellate courts?
Well, the lesson I would like to give them is try, even against opposition, to get back to that secret which the English judges of old had in the Privy Council. Don't just confine yourself in the little jurisdiction in which you work. Even if you get pushback from the bench, try to give them help. And if it's helpful, then judges will generally welcome it. Some may not. There is a bit of a tendency in Australia, as in the United States, to want to have nothing to do with any other system. The Americans have always been, what will I say? They've always been sort of America first, and they have this
Legally xenophobic, I think.
it's self-contained, and in fairness to them, they've got 50 jurisdictions plus the federal and the territories, so they've got plenty of comparative law, whereas in smaller jurisdictions of the Commonwealth we don't have that. And that's why this series, the Law Reports of the Commonwealth, is so important, because it has the mixture of cases that can sometimes actually be really helpful. So, but that's just there will be judges who'll push back. They'll say, why are you going there? You know, we've got perfectly good High Court of Australia decisions. Why are you doing this to us? You know, I just happen to have the view that if you're in a final court, what Julius Stone said to me as a law student was right. You can't solve all the problems of the world, but neither are you released from the obligation to try and to do the best you can. And sometimes you can be helped by insights from very clever people who are in the courts of other countries.
Brilliant, thank you. Now we turn now to the our final section, which is our rapid fire section. And the first question we have, and of course we just like a quick answer to these. What did you enjoy most in practice, the intellectual exercise or the interpersonal skills?
Well, I liked them both. How can you divorce the one from the other? I liked being courteous to clients and getting their trust, and that they would speak of me years to come, and maybe still do. And you got to remember that.
Okay. The opponent that you respected the most as an advocate?
Well, if I said that, that would lead to tremendous jealousy on the part of others. Yeah.
From any guess.
I wouldn't like to hurt those who thought that they were by far the best ever to swim into my ken.
Who did you learn from the most as an advocate?
I think it was probably Justice Glass, because he was more conceptual than most. The problem with the common law is that it tends to be just solve the immediate problem, whereas Justice Glass knew you are more likely to get a long-term solution if you think conceptually, and hence my effort to think in terms of context and concept, and that is what he taught me.
As an advocate, how did you handle losing a case?
Pretty well, actually. I never had difficulty sleeping because I worked so hard, and because I settled into a tradition of starting at 5:15 in the morning. I had to be in bed and asleep by 10:30 at the latest. And unlike Mrs. Thatcher, I needed sleep. Most people do need about 7 hours sleep. So if you get to bed early and when you rise early, you can perform better. And that's very important for your amour propre, to feel you've done a good job. When you have a day when you feel you've done a good job, it's a blissful day to be an advocate. When you don't feel you've done a good job, it's Hades.
What would you identify as the single most important quality in an advocate?
Organization skills and time allocation, so that you don't put off the difficult task because there are all these little easy tasks that you can do, and then you get into a terrible pickle with it's like the Titanic going towards the iceberg. That iceberg is there and it won't go away or melt conveniently. So you've got to tackle things in their priority. And I found that with my clerks in the courts, those who could time manage better ultimately became better barristers and lawyers.
Brilliant. I think we've got a picture of what your day is now and what it has been like for decades in terms of your hard work. My final question is, what does Michael Kirby do when he relaxes?
Well, when I'm tempted, I look at Wikipedia. Everybody turns up their nose at Wikipedia, but it's got tremendous amount of knowledge on science, on music, on culture, of different lands and different religious beliefs and so on. And you don't even have to stick to Wikipedia. There are actually other things on the internet, and it's full of information. I'm actually interested in science. AIDS and COVID-19 have taught me that that's going to be increasingly important for the human species, as is nuclear weapons and climate change, and so many things in the world depend on science. So, and science and Dr. Kinsey gave me redemption. They told me, you are not queer in the old sense of it. You are not weird. You are just a member of a minority, and it's all part of nature's grand design, and it would not regularly occur in nature if it didn't have a purpose. And that was very reassuring to me.
Well, Michael, I have to say, it surprises me not that you relax by continuing to learn. That's been a fascinating interview. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for listening to Advocates, the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow us on all our social media channels. Leave a review or share this episode and tag us. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you.
Listen to the voices of the advocate.